Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Aliens took years. Humans did it in a day, the pirate technique that mapped the unknown. For over a decade, the Zero Cartographers Guild had dedicated its vast resources to mapping the Nebula Rift, a chaotic, unpredictable expanse of space where conventional navigation systems failed. The rift was a death trap for even the most advanced exploration ships, a shifting labyrinth of plasma storms, rogue asteroids, and gravitational anomalies that made any attempt at charting stable routes an exercise in futility. The Guild, composed of some of the finest navigators and astrophysicists in the galaxy, had deployed thousands of drones, invested billions in computational resources, and consulted with the most intelligent AI models known to their civilization. Yet, after 10 long years, they had little to show for their efforts. Their star charts were riddled with inconsistencies. Corridors that appeared stable one day would collapse into nothingness the next, and the further they ventured into the rift, the more they realized they were getting nowhere. Frustration had settled deep within the Guild's ranks. Their most esteemed members, scholars with lifetimes dedicated to the study of cosmic navigation, argued endlessly over the best course of action. Some believed the key was in advanced quantum computations. Others insisted on further AI calibration, while the more radical voices suggested abandoning the project altogether. The rift, they claimed, was simply unmappable, an anomaly meant to remain unexplored. It was in the middle of one such heated debate that Captain Ilias Kane entered the Guild's grand station orbiting the rift's outermost boundary. A human freelancer with a reputation for taking on impossible jobs, he had been drawn to the challenge the same way Earth's ancient seafarers had been drawn to the uncharted waters of their own planet. Where others saw impossibility, he saw an opportunity. His ship, the Wayfarer, was an older model outfitted not with the latest navigation systems but with modifications of his own design. It was small, built for maneuverability rather than firepower, and unlike the larger, bulkier vessels used by the Guild, it did not rely on the fragile AI-assisted mapping systems that had continuously failed in the rift. When he first approached the Guild's council chamber, he was met with immediate skepticism. The Zero were a species that prided themselves on intelligence and precision. Their culture revolved around meticulous calculations and scientific rigor, and they had long considered humans to be reckless, impulsive creatures, resourceful perhaps, but lacking the discipline necessary for serious astrophysical pursuits. Kane, dressed in a worn-out flight jacket with a confident smirk on his face, only confirmed their prejudices. "You think you can do in a day what we have failed to accomplish in a decade?" One of the senior cartographers, an elderly Zero with deep-set silver eyes, leaned forward, folding his spindly fingers together. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of barely restrained irritation. Kane nodded. "That's right. One day, 24 standard hours. I'll map the rift. And when I come back, I'll have a safe passage drawn out for you." A murmur spread through the council chamber. Some of the younger members coughed openly, while others simply shook their heads. One even let out a derisive chuckle. The idea was absurd. It had taken their AI models months to process even the most basic movement patterns within the rift, and even then the data was unreliable. How could a single human, armed with outdated techniques, possibly hope to succeed? "And what, pray, is your method?" The senior cartographer pressed. "Will you divine the path through sheer instinct?" Kane smirked. "Something like that. Ever hear of old Earth pirates?" The silence that followed was thick with confusion. Some of the Zero exchanged glances, clearly trying to recall any historical reference that might be relevant. Most of them had studied human history in passing, but the concept of pirates, seafaring outlaws who had roamed Earth's oceans centuries ago, was hardly something they expected to be relevant to deep space navigation. Kane leaned back against the nearest console, crossing his arms. Back in the old days, before computers, before satellites, humans navigated the oceans using the stars, ocean currents, wind patterns, stuff that couldn't be thrown off by technology failing. Pirates, they had to be better at it than anyone else because their lives depended on it. They used tricks that modern AI wouldn't even consider, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Laughter broke out among the council members. The idea was preposterous. The rift was not an ocean. There were no winds, no tides, no magnetic fields that could be measured the way Earth's sailors had once done. It was chaos, pure and simple. No one could possibly hope to predict it. But Kane wasn't joking. "All I need is clearance to enter, and you'll see for yourselves," he said. I'll be back before your next shift change." The council debated among themselves for a moment. The general consensus was that he was a fool, but he was also a well-known navigator with an impressive track record of surviving places others had not. And in the end, the guild was desperate. If he failed, it would simply be another mark against humanity's reckless arrogance. If by some miracle he returned with anything useful, then they had nothing to lose. "Very well," the senior cartographer said at last. "You have 24 hours. When you return, if you return, you will present your findings. If your attempt ends in failure, you will not waste our time again." Kane grinned. "Deal." As he walked out of the chamber, he could feel the eyes of every zero in the room burning into his back, filled with disbelief, condescension, and perhaps the faintest hint of curiosity. He didn't care. He had faced worse odds before, and deep down, he already knew what they didn't. This wasn't going to be the challenge they thought it was. Because he wasn't going in blind. He had spent years studying navigation techniques that most have forgotten, and more importantly, he understood something the guild never had: space, just like the oceans of old Earth, had patterns. You just had to know where to look. Kane sat in the cockpit of the Wayfarer, fingers drumming lightly against the control panel as the countdown ticked toward zero. The station's docking clamps released, and his ship drifted free, gliding into the dark expanse beyond the guild's perimeter. The sensors immediately flooded with warnings. Chaotic gravitational distortions, unstable energy readings, shifting debris fields. But he ignored them. The guild had spent years trying to fight against the rift, relying on AI and automated mapping systems that couldn't adapt to its chaotic nature. Kane didn't intend to make the same mistake. He powered down most of the ship's automated systems, leaving only the core essentials running. The sophisticated navigation programs, the ones the Zero considered indispensable, were worthless here. Instead, he pulled the leather-bound notebook from his side pocket and flipped it open. The pages were filled with rough sketches, notes scrawled in his own handwriting, and star charts that most modern navigators would have dismissed as primitive. But Kane had studied the old ways, the techniques used by Earth's most notorious explorers and pirates, men who had charted the unknown with nothing but the stars and their instincts. Reaching over, he flicked a switch, activating the ship's manual thrusters. A low hum vibrated through the hull as the Wayfarer shifted course, aligning with the first reference point he had chosen. A distant pulsar, barely visible through the dense haze of the rift, pulsed in rhythmic intervals. It was a constant, a fixed marker in the ever-shifting storm. The Zero had dismissed it as irrelevant, claiming the interference rendered it useless for navigation. Kane saw it differently. He made a quick notation in his book, marking the pulsar's position relative to the guild station, then, adjusting his heading, he scanned the rift with nothing but his eyes. The dense plasma clouds twisted like slow-moving whirlpools, their movements seemingly random. But he wasn't looking at the chaos. He was looking for patterns. A stream of debris passed his ship, small fragments of ice and metal moving in an oddly consistent arc. He tapped a finger against his book, comparing it to the notes he had taken before launching. It matched what he had suspected. The rift wasn't just a swirling mess of anomalies. It had currents, gravitational flows that dictated the movement of matter. The Zero had spent years trying to fight against them, forcing their ships into unstable zones. Kane wasn't going to fight the rift. He was going to move with it. He adjusted the ship's angle slightly, aligning with the drift of the debris. The Wayfarer shuddered as it was pulled into the flow, but Kane kept his grip steady. The guild's ships had struggled against these currents, burning through fuel as they tried to force their way through. He let the rift guide him, barely touching the controls. The pull intensified, dragging him deeper as the plasma storms thickened around him. Kane relied on another trick from the past. He tilted his head, watching the way the light refracted through the swirling gases. To an untrained eye, it was an incomprehensible mess, but to him, it was just like reading the sky before a storm on old Earth. The color shifts, the movement of the clouds, each told a story. He adjusted course again, just slightly, and slipped between two converging currents moments before they collided in a violent burst of energy. He smirked. The guild sensors would have marked that zone as impassable. He had just found a safe passage. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a small device, a custom-built tool he had designed for exactly this kind of situation. It wasn't a traditional scanner. Instead of trying to impose a rigid grid on the rift, it simply collected raw observational data, mimicking how old world sailors had tracked the movements of the sea. He activated it and set it on the console. As he continued forward, he marked each fixed celestial point he could find, the pulsars, the distant quasars, even the faintest stars that remained visible through the storm. Unlike AI, he didn't need perfect accuracy. He needed relationships between points, the way ancient pirates had used the stars to find their way across vast, featureless oceans. A sudden alarm blared through the cockpit, jolting him from his focus. A gravitational anomaly was forming ahead, its presence indicated by a violent ripple in space-time. Kane tightened his grip on the controls. He had anticipated something like this. The rift wasn't just a storm. It was alive in its own way, shifting and evolving. He flipped through his notes again, eyes scanning the crude sketches and hastily scribbled equations. He had seen something similar before, on a different job, a different system. There had been a rogue moon caught in the orbit of a dying star. Its gravity had twisted the surrounding space in a way that mimicked what he was seeing now. Back then, he had used a simple trick to escape. Adjusting the ship's trajectory, he let the anomaly's pull take hold, angling the Wayfarer so that it would slingshot around the disturbance instead of fighting against it. The ship groaned in protest as the forces strained against his hull, but Kane held steady. Timing was everything. Too early, and he'd be flung back into the storm. Too late, and he'd be torn apart. The moment came. He fired the thrusters in a sharp burst, breaking free from the gravity well just as it collapsed behind him. The ship lurched, then steadied. He exhaled slowly. Checking his device, he noted how the gravitational eddies had changed in the wake of the collapse. The rift had shifted, as it always did, but now he had a new fixed point. He marked it down. One by one, he connected the dots. The celestial markers, the movement of debris, the gravitational currents. Each was a piece of the puzzle. The Zero had been trying to impose order on chaos. Kane had stopped trying to control it. Instead, he listened. Hours passed fast as he worked. He barely touched the ship's systems, relying instead on instinct and observation. Bit by bit, the rift revealed itself to him. The safe paths weren't obvious, not at first, but they were there. He just had to see them. As he finished sketching another section of the route, he allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't just mapping the rift. He was reading it, the way old pirates had read the sea. And he was winning. Kane tightened his grip on the control stick as the Wayfarer hurtled deeper into the rift. The ship's hull vibrated under the strain, the metal groaning in protest as gravitational distortions twisted space around him. The rift was no longer a distant challenge. It was alive, surrounding him, closing in like the relentless pull of a storm. The plasma clouds thickened ahead, swirling in violent eddies, their hues shifting unpredictably from deep violet to electric blue. He had studied their patterns for hours now, but here, at the heart of the rift, it were faster, more chaotic. The glow from the ionized gases bathed his cockpit in an eerie light, making it feel like he was drifting through the eye of a storm just before it unleashed its fury. He exhaled sharply and adjusted the ship's heading, following the subtle variations in the cloud formations. The Guild had tried to brute force their way through these zones, relying on shielding and power-hungry engines to push forward. Kane wasn't interested in a contest of strength. He had already discovered that the rift didn't work like that. The clouds pulsed, folding into themselves, revealing a break in the storm, an opening barely large enough for his ship. He pushed the throttle forward, accelerating toward the gap just as it began to close. The moment had to be perfect. A second too soon, and he'd be crushed by converging forces. A second too late, and he'd be trapped. The Wayfarer shot through the passage, narrowly escaping as the plasma closed behind him with a deafening burst of energy. His instruments flared in protest, warning of unstable currents, but he ignored them. He had passed through the first barrier. Now came the real test. Ahead, a shifting field of debris loomed, remnants of old ships and shattered asteroids caught in the rift's merciless grip. Most of the wrecks were unidentifiable, twisted metal, scorched hulls, the remains of long-forgotten explorers who had dared to challenge this place. Some were still intact, their darkened shells a testament to those who had entered but never returned. Kane didn't slow down. He couldn't. The rift wasn't just a maze. It was moving. Everything inside it was in constant motion, and if he hesitated, he'd be swept away like so many before him. He adjusted his trajectory, weaving through the debris with precise, deliberate movements. A broken frigate loomed ahead, its jagged remains spinning slowly in the rift's gravitational pull. He studied its rotation, predicting its path, then angled the ship downward, slipping just beneath it as it drifted past. His fingers moved instinctively, adjusting the thrusters, compensating for sudden shifts in momentum. He had spent years flying through asteroid fields, navigating through war zones where a single mistake meant death. But this was different. The rift wasn't an enemy. It wasn't something to fight. It was something to understand. A sudden flare of energy erupted to his right. His sensors barely had time to register it before a gravitational wave slammed into the ship, sending it into a violent spin. The Wayfarer lurched sideways, warning lights flashing across the console as the artificial gravity struggled to stabilize. Kame gritted his teeth, fighting against the force that threatened to tear his ship apart. He couldn't counteract it directly. The power of the rift was too great, but he could use it. He pulled back on the controls, letting the ship ride the wave instead of resisting it. The Wayfarer twisted, rolling through the turbulence, momentum carrying it forward in a controlled spiral. He adjusted his angle, shifting his weight with the pull rather than against it, using the rift's own force to propel himself forward. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the ship steady once more. He exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. He had expected gravitational surges, but not ones that strong. He needed to be faster, smarter. He scanned the debris field again, searching for anything useful. Most of the wreckage was dead, long since stripped of power, their systems nothing but hollow shells. But then something caught his eye, a flicker of movement, a soft glow deep within the wreckage. He adjusted course, maneuvering toward it. The ship in question was larger than the others, its design unfamiliar. It had been here a long time, that much was clear. Its hull was coated in layers of ionized dust, its markings worn away by centuries of exposure to the rift's forces. But the glow meant something was still active inside. He hesitated for only a moment before engaging the docking clamps. His ship latched onto the wreck with a metallic clang, stabilizing itself against the drifting structure. He grabbed his helmet, sealing it into place before stepping into the airlock. The door hissed open, and he stepped inside the ancient ship. The atmosphere was thin but breathable. The lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the ruined corridor. Dust floated in the zero-gravity environment, disturbed by his movements. He moved carefully, his boots magnetizing to the deck with each step. The ship's architecture was unlike anything he had seen before. Sleek, almost organic in design, with curved hallways and intricate engravings along the walls. This was no ordinary wreck. He reached what looked like the ship's control center. A console pulsed faintly, its power reserves nearly depleted. He placed a hand against it, feeling the vibrations beneath his fingers. There was still something here, buried deep in the ship's memory. He pulled a small interface device from his belt, connecting it to the console. Lines of ancient code scrolled across his screen, unreadable at first, but then fragments of navigation data, star charts, gravitational readings. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a wreck. This was a lost navigation vessel, one that had been mapping the rift long before the Guild had even known it existed.